Tēnā koutou katoa. Today's Kauwhau preparation series, our sermon preparation series video is going to be focusing on the contrasting stories from our Old Testament lections around, first of all, King Saul and then King David. And I'm going to try and keep this fairly short because I think there's one really key point that's already been brought out in what has been sent out by the Reverend Sela Havili from John Goldingay's Old Testament for Everyone commentary. And that's that the determining, the really significant difference between Saul and David is in their loyalty. To whom is their loyalty given? And this only becomes really clear when we take the whole story of Saul and David into account. But John Goldingay, I think, really helpfully points out to us one of the aspects of the story that helps us to see this. Even though Saul is, your influencer kind of figure, he's ripped, he's handsome, he's got everything you'd want in a king. And during the search for David, we're told that, there's not so obvious that this is the person, the kind of person. But then later on, it turns out David is actually this kind of idealized figure as well. He's an amazing musician, he's a brilliant warrior, he's also seen as being very handsome and so forth. So in some respects, even though the story is of a search for somebody with a different heart, there is also a recognition that David, like Saul, is still this idealized figure. And of course, we still look to leaders like that. It's often ideal in our view if they look the part and can act the part, as well as be, in a deep sense, a person of the kind of moral character that we would like. And as you go through the story of David, you see that even though Saul very obviously failed, and this brought God's judgment on him, David also obviously failed, and you would have to say in some pretty significant ways in terms of his approach to things like murder. It's not ideal in your good and godly king for the king to arrange the murder of somebody else, as David eventually does with Uriah. And it's also not great if your king does things which God has instructed him not to, as it turns out, with things like the census, with his overall, with his adultery with Bathsheba, for example, and with his general involvement in a life of violence, which God eventually highlights as being something significant. Now, in all these ways, and I think the same is true in every character we find in the Old or New Testament, who's a human character, whose life is recounted in any detail, the scriptures make sure to tell us that this person is a very flawed leader, that while in one sense they embody those things that we know we need a leader who can take us into the reality, the lived, embodied reality of God's kingdom restored here on earth. At the same time, every human leader we look to turns out to be deeply flawed. But there is a significant difference between Saul and David, and that's in the person to whom they are giving their loyalty. And the contrast is made between David, whose loyalty is to Yahweh, to the God of Israel alone, and to Saul, whose loyalty is given elsewhere as well. And this is reflected in a bunch of different ways in the story, but it's also a consistent part of both the Old and the New Testaments, that we are to have undivided hearts. Our loyalty cannot be given both to God and to something or someone else. Now, that's the same whether it's, in the Old Testament where there were competing gods. We might, for example, think about how we talk about and engage with the concept of atua as well within this. But there's one thing that's very clear. Only the God of Israel, revealed by name as Yahweh, which, by the way, I know perfectly well is not the likely pronunciation of it, but it's the common one that we use these days. The God who is named as Ihwa in our Paipera Tapu, that God alone is the one to whom our loyalty is to be given, our worship is offered, whether that's the worship that we do in karakia or the worship that we give in our daily lives. That contrast is found all the way through the Old Testament prophets too. And often I think we read these stories with eyes out for a particular thing. So, for example, when we read the prophets, some of us will be inclined to see only issues of justice, other people only issues of morality, other people, again, only issues of loyalty. But these three things are bound up together. That loyalty to Ihwa alone, as the person whom we worship and serve, is absolutely critical. I think that this theme really comes through strongly in the David versus Saul comparison. And I think we then have an opportunity to think about why is that so important to humanity in the gospel narrative that comes through. And I think the key thing here is that God isn't insisting on loyalty alone out of some sort of caprice or in a sense trying to simply compel us in one direction because he just wants us to give a loyalty, but because it is life-giving to us. If he is the creator, if he is the source of all life and goodness, if by his spirit he dwells in people and restores humanity, then it's in loyalty to him alone, rather than in opening ourselves to other powers, that we have the possibility of sharing in the life that God gives, and we have the possibility of sharing in the restoration that God's Spirit offers to broken, wounded, marred humanity. And therefore, God wants us to give loyalty to him alone, because it's only in that we can discover the restoration that he can bring. So this is extremely important for us to grasp, that this is a life-giving call, not a condemnatory one. But nevertheless, if we abandon, as Saul did, our loyalty to God alone, then of course we're likely to suffer. We're going against the grain of the universe when we do that. Now, as we draw these comparisons between the two human kings, between Saul and David, I think there's another couple of things that we can highlight in our preaching. One is that as humans, we long for leadership. Sometimes we don't feel like we do. We want to be our own independent person. But nevertheless, you can see in the way that all societies and cultures operate that we long for some expression of leadership. But we're torn, because every time we see human leaders, we see failure as well. The same is true with Saul and with David. And so we're left in these stories with a sense of incompleteness of God's work. Even though he's brought these kings into their positions, at the same time, neither of them really hits the spot. David is closer than Saul, but still a deeply marred figure. And so when we are preaching about this, I think it's really important to both open up to people that even if we think we simply want a relationship with God alone, that there is built within us some desire to be led well as well, and for there to be a human expression of this. And therefore, we ought to be praying for, hoping for, expecting human leaders to be part of our life within a restored world, within the restored mini world of the church, but also within society. And at the same time, our deeply common recognition that all leaders are failure prone and limited in what they offer ought to point us towards the one human king who has embodied all the virtues that we long for without any of the failures that we so frequently see. And so I think it's important that we do point people towards Jesus Christ as the true king, and that we say that in him, the story of Israel's kingship is retold. He's like Saul, but in very, very important ways differs. He's like David, but in very important ways differs again. And you can tease out in your own preaching and preparation the ways in which he is both similar and different. But I wonder if you can identify that for both Saul and David, I think there's a sense in which power corrupts them, and that in Jesus Christ we see somebody who is utterly uncorrupted by power, and by his lack of corruption of it, his willingness to give it up, to serve other people as the hallmark of his leadership, doesn't stand against his right to command or his ownership of the world or any of those other things that we ascribe to human leaders. It doesn't take away his right to those things. And yet in holding those things lightly, letting them go in order to serve, we see a very different model of what kingship looks like, but also we see something which is unachievable for all other human leaders. So we never hold out simply this is a challenge to our human leaders to say, oh, you need to live up to the example of Jesus Christ. Of course they do. But the story of Saul and David helps us to recall that our human leaders will never achieve that in this age of the world until Jesus returns. And so our gaze always ought to be pointed towards Jesus Christ as the King. And this also moderates and limits our own idea of who we are and what we're doing as human leaders, because it says that I'm a steward, for example, for me in the church, I'm a steward of leadership that is really Jesus Christ's, and it's in a sense partially entrusted to me for a while, but I'm going to have to hand it back. I'm not actually the king in any sense. I'm simply somebody who is working for the king to enact his will on his behalf. So that kind of moderation of human leadership is important, and I think it's helpful too. And then how we think about how we tell human stories. So I think the model of, say, a poroporoaki, where we the night before, we can tell all the stories, good and bad, about a person, ought to liberate us then in a funeral service to, as I've heard Bishop Kitzel say, the greatest thing we can say of somebody is of the work of Jesus Christ in their life. And so we reflect really on the way in which they engaged with Jesus Christ, their loyalty, those things that we see in Jesus Christ that are reflected in their own lives, rather than trying to tell a story of them either as a wholly virtuous person, which is, of course, never true, or indeed as a solely flawed person, which is also never true and seems deeply inappropriate. So what I'm suggesting is that there's a way of narrating even an individual person's life in that context of a funeral, which ought to give us a sense that what we're really doing is seeing past them to the one true leader, the one true person whose life is lived flawlessly, which is Jesus Christ. You may well think of other examples or to interact with in your own sermon, but I think the critical thing here is that when we tell the story of Saul and David, that the place we land ends up pointing people towards Jesus Christ as the true king, and recognizing that kingliness is one of the created ideas for humanity. So one of the reasons that we all long to sort of be in charge in some sense is that it's a slightly misdirected longing for that sense in which all of us are mandated as human beings to lead in this process of the growth, the flourishing, the building up of this world. But it often ends up misdirected at us. Nevertheless, the story of Saul and David is a story, just as a prophet, any story of a prophet is a story of our prophetic vocation as human beings. The story of Saul and David is a story of our human vocation. So we want to point towards Jesus as the absolute king, but we also want to recognize that in his kingliness, and similarly in the stories of Saul and David, they're fulfilling part of the human vocation. And so Jesus, in his unique role as the one king over all, also calls us into an idea of what it means to lead and to serve in whatever way is entrusted to us, that is part of our general human call. So do you get the difference there? We're not trying to say we're all kings in the way that Jesus is, but that Jesus' kingship lets us see our human call into leadership in whatever sphere we exist, in a way that redefines our human vocation and brings to light and life what was always intended for humanity. So may God bless you as you prepare, and as you seek to help people to feed on the Word of God this coming Sunday. Mā te atua koutou e manaaki i tēnei wā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.